Well, good morning. Oh, and welcome to the Big Picture of the Bible. Let me ask you to mute everybody but Bill Pitts to mute your mics now, because I can hear you talking to each other. Hatley, yours is still on. I don't see Hatley there, but just mute your computers. John Anderson, Rachel, I think yours needs to be muted. Well, let me welcome you to the first of 4 seminars on the big picture of the Bible. I think that this is something that we'll all benefit from. I certainly have benefited from it in the past. I was raised in a Baptist church from the time I can remember, and I used to hear a lot of Bible stories, but I had a hard time putting them in context. I didn't know where they all fit together. And in our church in Waco, about 30 years ago or so, the minister of education said, he said, I think our people could study the Bible and teach the Bible better if they had more background. So we organized a session, lasted all year, to help people on this. And this series here was one of them, and Bill Pitts taught it, and it really helped. And particularly, I did it about 4 years, and after I'd heard it 4 years, I really got it. But it helps us all to enable us to study the Bible, to see it better. It's organized, the sessions are organized according to 10 major periods of Hebrew and Christian history. And the first session that we'll have, one today, is on the first 3 periods. I think all of you there was an attachment that showed this booklet. If you want a hard copy of this booklet, they're over at the welcome desk at the worship place, and you can certainly get it. So you don't want to have to print it all. It's about 30 pages long, 35 pages long. But it's very, very helpful, and I think you'll want to read it and as you prepare for these and after you followed up on them a little bit. If you look on page, when you get it, if you look on page 4 or 5, you'll see a big timeline. There was one of these on the brochure that described it, that has the history of the Bible. And it pretty well, what it does, it just shows where the books of the Bible are in approximately the timelines that are shown. I'll get to that in just a minute. Let me move on to the next slide. Yes. I mentioned about the booklet, and I did ask you to mute your sound. At the end, you can unmute so that you can ask questions and make comments. We will record this seminar, and it will be posted on the Worship Place website starting next week. And so if you want to review it again, or you have some friends that didn't get to see it or something, we have several people that are signed up and couldn't make it this one, they'll be able to watch the recording. And all 4 of the seminars will be viewed on those. As I mentioned, this timeline is what you can see is that we're following it. The session today goes between that red dot and that red dot there on this timeline, and it covers three of the 10 major periods. Let me introduce you, if you haven't met him, Dr. Bill Pitts, my good close friend. He's recently retired from Baylor University in the last year or 2. He's an internationally known scholar and writer and speaker on church history. He's one of his great assets is he's married to Dr. Ruth Landis Pitts, and who's an incredible pianist and a teacher. They have 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. One of their sons was my cardiologist. And the Pitts family have been our friends from Rita and I for over 45 years. And I just appreciate Bill doing this for us. He conducted a live seminar on this about 3 years ago, and it was done well. And we printed copies of this booklet at that time, and about 300 copies were distributed. But earlier this year, he also presented the History of Christianity seminar, and recordings of that are also on the Worship Place website under recorded events. Seminar today, as I mentioned, will be covering 3 periods: creation, flood, Abraham, Moses, and Exodus, and covers the Bible books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Bill, I'll turn this over to you now.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. I'd like to express my thanks to the Worship Place for sponsoring this project, and to you, Dan, for all of your work. It was your idea, and you've done the technical support and all the promotion for this project. So thanks certainly in order to you as well. So as Dan said, we will begin with early stages of Scripture. This first part of the Bible is called by the Hebrew people themselves, the Jewish people, the Torah, Torah. The idea there is that it is a pointer, a kind of a guideline for life. And of course, embedded in all of this is the 10 Commandments and many other. Are you?
No paper.
Mr. Hadley, you need to mute your mic.
Okay.
Okay. So the Old Testament, as we call it, or the Hebrew Bible, has 3 major divisions. The first is the Torah, or law. The second is the prophets, and the third is the miscellaneous, the poetic sections and so forth. So we'll be doing each of those in turn as we work through this study together. There's a great deal of attention given to especially Genesis and Exodus because those are so foundational for so many of the ideas and beliefs that are held in the Jewish community and in the Christian community as well. So our first unit really is Genesis 1 through 11. And this has to do with beginnings, with origins of things. And that's spelled out in especially, I'd say, 4 major events or categories, beginning with creation. So creation being first, and then that is followed in chapter 3 by the sin of Adam and Eve, and then the judgment that is placed on humanity in 2 major forms, the flood and the Tower of Babel. So those 4 things highlight these first 11 chapters, and we'll spend a little time with those now.
Whoops.
The oldest account that we have of the creation comes in Genesis 2. It has to do with God and the creation of life in general, especially God and human beings. Adam is the first creation. The word means mankind, and so a number of people see him as the first man. Another category of interpretation emphasizes this is all of humanity and the creation of all of humanity. The God who is the creator is Yahweh. This is the term that is used for the Hebrew name for God. And God is depicted here in what we call anthropomorphic terms. That simply means human changed, or using human categories to explain God. So for example, God walks in the garden, God shapes the human form, God speaks, God sees, and so on. So how do we think about God? Well, one way is by analogy with humanity, but then we also have other ways of thinking about God. Now, the order of creation in chapter 2 is first Adam, and then other living things, and then at the end of the chapter, to complete it, is the creation of Eve. So she is next in order of creation. And the place where they live, their home, is called Eden. This is a kind of depicted as sort of a paradise. Okay, if we move on then to the Next
Okay.
slide. So we have another account. This is called the priestly account. And here we have a different view of God. They back up and and give us a picture of the entire world, creation of the entire world or the universe. Here, God does not shape uh, the human being, but he calls things into being. God is remote, God is powerful, he speaks, and it's the power of creation through speaking that you get in Genesis 1. It also gives us an order of creation in a 6-day scheme that is laid out here. So here we get another view of God. The first one is God is imminent. He is immediately present. He's active in the making of Adam. And here he is transcendent and distant and powerful, remote, and simply calls things into being. So we think about both of those and we think about our understanding of God as being both transcendent and immanent, both distant and powerful, and at the same time, one that sticketh closer than a brother. So the presence of God among us and with us, we affirm both of those ideas of God in our understanding of faith today. All right, let's move on. So interpretation of the accounts is really important, and there's a great deal of discussion about this, obviously, in our society and our culture today. So we might ask, is this primarily theology or religion, or is it science, or is it history? Is it all three? Is it in some way um, a combination of all of those kinds of things? Um, the problem here in interpretation today is that you have two authorities at work. One is the authority of the Bible or scripture, and another is the authority of science. And we, I think, look to both of those for truth in our lives and our understanding of things. So, for example, about 1650, Bishop Ussher, who was in Ireland, had time on his hands. And so he worked through the chronology of the Old Testament. He worked backwards. And you have a lot of numbers in there about how long the kings ruled and how many years and days and so forth. And then the age of the antediluvians, those who came before the flood and so forth. He added everything up and came up with the number 4004 BC as the day of creation. He had it at 9 o'clock in the morning, sometime in October. So if you add 4004 BC to where we are now, 2000, that would give us an age of the earth as 6,000 years. The very first Bible I was given, the Holman Study Bible, has at the bottom of the page for Genesis 1, 4004 BC. So that's Ussher's dates that were added, obviously not in the Bible itself, but added on. And so that view of the recent creation of the earth has taken hold in a lot of circles. The scientists, however, had a different view of things. Sir Charles Lyell, in his Principles of Geology, said, well, things, I think, by studying the layers of sediment and layers of rocks that are left to us, it would take a long, long time for those to be created, particularly if you believe that a lot of this creation occurs by erosion from wind and water and so forth. So Lyell's view prevailed in science, and so also did the idea of the great age of the earth. So today, scientists tell us that our earth is something like, what, 4 billion years old, and the universe as we know it, about 14 billion years. So that's, obviously two very different views of how we understand the world around us. Then if you add to that, what's not on here, but if you add to that Darwin and his position on biology, then it becomes even more acute for people. They're more concerned about human life, obviously, than about the age of rocks. And so Darwin also, in his view, challenged the understanding that everything was created and that it is still with us. And he saw a kind of connection of all life together. And some of that life has gone and other emerged and so forth, or his famous doctrine of evolution. So three options arose after Darwin's 1859 publication. One extreme was to reject science. Another extreme was to reject religion. And another position, a mediating position taken by most ministers, was to affirm that there is truth in both of these. There was a famous debate that transpired at Oxford the very next year following Darwin's publication in 1860. And Wilberforce was representing the church and he rejected science. Huxley was representing science and he rejected religion. So the story is, and this is probably apocryphal, but it illustrates the point that Soapy Sam Wilberforce said to Huxley, "Are you descended from the monkey on your mother's side or your father's side?" And Huxley responded, "I'd rather be descended from the monkey on both sides than to be as ignorant of science as you are." And so, you know, the level of debate started off pretty hot and has still remained an important issue in those matters, that issue today. Some of the earliest ministers in our world of that day, such as Beecher and Abbott and others, began to see very clearly that that science had a place to stand and that the authority of the scripture had a place to stand. And so they started working out ways to accommodate and to affirm the truth of both of those. All right, let's move on. Contemporary theories designed to reconcile science and religion. The recent creation idea says that God created things recently, but he created them to look old. So the problem with that is, why would God fool us? You know, the gap theory is there's a big time lapse between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, but there's no manuscript evidence for that. The reason for this is people do see that the age of the earth is quite old, but they want to affirm a recent creation of humanity. The day age theory, this came early in interpretation, where the Bible itself says that a day is as 1,000 years in the sight of God. So this is to interpret the days of earth, or the emergence of earth and water and mountains and trees and animals and so on and so forth. So the problem then seems to arise when science tries to rule on religion or religion tries to rule on science. They both, I think, have validity and they both have much to teach us scientifically. So this last one is a much more recent approach, but it would simply say that we have language to try to explain things that we do not understand. For example, the Greeks, as bright as they were, had no idea how the sun rose and what caused that to happen. So they had a story about Apollo driving the horses through the sky and pulling the sun with him, going down at sunset and starting all over again the next day. Well, that was a story to explain what they didn't understand. They had stories like, why do people fall in love? And why do they not? How does that happen? And so they had little cupids flying around shooting arrows and so forth. And that's still something of a mystery to us. And our, you know, our Valentine's cards often carry these little figures as well. So there is that level of not knowing or mystery or whatever, and addressing it in an account such as this. All right, let's move on. Well, I should say the first two of those theories are keen to keep day as a 24-hour period. The latter two, 3 and 4, give that up in order to accommodate the idea of, well, this is a different approach with what we know about the world from science. All right, let's go on.
Please mute your mics. That we keep hearing background stuff where your husband or your wife is calling you from the background.
Thank you. So if we compare these two accounts, J and P, the name for God in one is Yahweh, in the other it's Elohim. And what is created is humankind, and that's chapter 2, and the entire world in chapter 1. The means of creation, God fashions with his hands, as it were, or God speaks. The time frame, no reference to a time frame in J, but we have a definite 6-day creation time frame in P. The conception of God in the first is anthropomorphic, and the other is removed and transcendent. Now this J and P business, and J and E, D and P, goes to the question of who wrote these words and how it was constructed and so forth. And that's a little more technical than we want to be. But the idea is, then you have time to be here, the idea of J is that this document always uses the name Yahweh, whereas the next writer always uses the name Elohim. And these then are parallel accounts that are put together, and sometimes they're interwoven one with another, and so on. So you do get a lot of different varieties of affirmations about God as we move along here. All right, let's move on. All right, the next slide. So when we study a philosophy or religion, the major categories is, what does this say about God? What does it say about the world in which we live? And what does it say about humanity? So the Hebrews make no attempt to prove that God exists. God's existence is simply assumed. In the beginning, God. So that's a confession of faith. That's a confession of belief. That's a starting point. And God is certainly the central figure in the Hebrew scriptures. And that name appears over and over again. All right, let's move on. God's sovereignty, God's transcendence. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the sky, the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So the creation is by word, let us make. The idea of being created out of nothing is implied here. So this is different. The example is usually given is a carpenter has wood, has materials, and fashions something from that. But God here calls the wood into being, creates that out of nothing. Then the harmony and the goodness of creation. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God said that it was good. So what if we lived all the time in darkness? That's something we don't even want to contemplate. Let's move on. The supernatural versus the natural view of the world. So the Greeks give us this natural view, and that's the heritage that sort of starts us on science. They called it natural philosophy. We call it science today. Thales said, you know, everything probably should be reduced to one element. What's most common? And for him, it was water. Empedocles, another Greek thinker, came along a little later and said, no, it's more complicated than that. There are 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water. And all through the Middle Ages, that was pretty much the standard understanding of how everything was put together, different levels of those four elements. Then chemistry was born. People began to figure out that there are atoms and different arrangements and so forth, so that you have the chemicals that make up everything in the world today. For the Hebrews, the whole idea is to emphasize the revelation of God, that God calls things into being, whereas the Greeks are trying to understand what it is that constitutes the earth. There's a quotation there then from Einstein as well about science and religion. And most scientists have some view of this question. All right, let's move on. So humanity's position of honor is evident in this understanding of God and this account of creation. So you get over and over again, God created and said, this is good. God created and said, this is good. Here it's God created humanity and said, it's very good. So this is the idea that we value highly, is that we are created in the image of God. What that means has multiple kinds of interpretations, and different people in their own experience will feel that, will sense that in different ways. Does it mean our rational capacity, our ability to reason? Does it mean our moral capacity? Does it mean our sense of God? Does it mean the idea of conscience that tells us what's right and what's wrong? In any case, it is the basis for our valuing each other and valuing people all across the world. If we're truly made in the image of God and Jesus loves all the little children of the world, then there, it seems to me, is a foundation that's important for a Christian outlook today. All right. Now, so we've talked about God and we've talked about human beings. Now let's talk about the world. How did they envision the world? The Hebrew cosmology. Cosmology is simply your mental picture of what the world looks like. So here it's you have a little graph that's been created, and you'll see that it's in three parts. The earth is in the center there. That's where we live, where we would walk. But for the Hebrew people and the Babylonian people of that day, it's a similar kind of cosmology. Below this is Sheol. Sheol is under the earth, and this is where it's a place of the dead. It's not a place of punishment and torture and that sort of thing until much, much later on in Hebrew history. But there are the pillars of the earth that hold things up. Then in the firmament, the sky, you can see the stars, the moon, and so forth, and God sitting above all of that, the firmament. So this is the way that they viewed the world. Below Sheol is Tehom, or the great deep, the great ocean, and so forth, a chaotic mass of water. So the cosmology of the Babylonians and the Hebrews is the same. The Hebrews have come from Babylonia, so that's not surprising. Now, cosmogony is a related term, and it simply means, well, if that's your view of the world, then what is your view of how that came to be? How was it created? How did that happen? And so most religions are going to wrestle with this question: where we come from, where the world comes from, how that all began. So from Babylonia, we have an account called the Enuma Elish, translated when on high. And this is their story of creation. And it's a struggle between Apsu and Tiamat. Tiamat prevails in this battle. And then there's a further struggle between Tiamat and their offspring, Marduk. And Marduk prevailed. So Marduk becomes the major god in the Babylonian view of creation. But there, you see, it's creation comes out of conflict, and Tiamat is the waters. It is at first, and then the earth emerges from the waters, and you get chaos and try to get order out of that. Then Marduk creates people out of these materials, out of Tiamat. So instead of this idea of a creation out of nothing, it's creation out of another god. All right, let's move on. So similarities of the accounts in the Hebrew and Babylonian cosmology, you have the idea of beginning with chaos and bringing order out of it. So both of them have that. Both of them have this common cosmology, that is a 3-layer cake understanding of the world. And then they both have, interestingly enough, a sequence of creative acts. So the sequence of 6 days that we have in the Bible is also there in the Babylonian literature as well. So that's similar. And that's to be expected if these people come from the same place. However, there are contrasts. There are unique things offered in the Bible that are not there in the Babylonian text. God is separated from matter. He's removed from matter completely. And so that's a huge difference there. The another contrast is in Babylonia, you have many gods to account for the origin of things, whereas it's only one God who is involved in the creation of the earth and of the world and of human beings in the Hebrew tradition. The means of creation is struggle for the Babylonians. It is the word of God and the speaking of God for the Hebrew people. The place of humanity in the end, human beings are created but end up in slavery or end up as servants of the God. Whereas in the Hebrew text, we're given the place of honor as made in the image of God. Or Psalm 8 says, he's made us just a little lower than the angels. So God, the creator of the world, and here are the compared cosmologies and cosmogonies of these two cultures. All right. Now, that's Genesis 1 and 2. That's a lot of time there, but you think about our understanding of the world and the world in which we live and how we deal with it. Some of it certainly goes back to these kinds of questions. And then we move on to the fall, which is the name given to the sin of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. The significance for Christian thought is then, if that's the case, then there's the need for redemption. And the whole, you could look at the Bible this way. Chapters 1 and 2, there's creation. Chapter 3, there's sin. And the entire remainder of it is, how are we going to reconnect with God? How are we going to be redeemed? How are we going to be saved? How are we going to restore our relationships with one another and with the world around us? Okay. The source of sin is not indicated. There's no attempt to try to explain that. It's just there. That's just a part of our experience. The role of the serpent is to tempt. Did God say? Try to put doubt in Eve's mind or Adam's mind. The nature of sin is basically, I want to know what God knows. I want to transcend my limitations and know whatever it is that God. So it's as the church will later say, our major sin is us. It's our egos. It's pride. It's self-centeredness. The appeal of sin, of course, here it's a fruit that is offered, but sin, in whatever form today, has its appeal. And whether it's entertainment of films of people who are getting criminals who get into trouble for stealing, and then the whole thing plays out, and they get their just reward and so forth, or whatever it is, there is some appeal or some reason that we're drawn to sin. But there's also important in the story the choice to sin. So there is a responsibility on the part of the individual. So you choose to eat of the apple or fruit, whatever it was. It's not named, I guess. So All right, let's move on. Now, consequences of a sin is what's really important also. And the guilt, certainly we've all sinned and felt guilt. There's all sorts of evidence for that. For the writer, it's they realized they were naked, and so they covered themselves. The source of guilt, it seems to me, is where you have a standard of behavior and then that you know or you've adopted, and then you break that or you go against it. Furthermore, I think you'll find this in all religions, this recognition that this is a universal human experience. So the consequences are further laid out by the writer to say the serpent. So the serpent is something we're afraid of or something that causes us alarm. It runs on its belly. It's cursed in these ways. The woman will have pain in childbirth. The man will have to labor. He'll have to toil all of his life. And further, before we go to the next slide, notice this is a very famous painting in one of the major churches in Florence. It's Masaccio's Expulsion. The expulsion simply means when Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. And here you have the angel above them with a sword. And I detect something of maybe a little bit of a smile on her face. Like, okay, it's time to go. You're really messed up. But that's just an impression I have. That's not an artist interpretation at all. But carry on, Dan. So we have alienation from God. That's the expulsion. But we also have God's mercy that is very clear in this account because God does not destroy these people. There is judgment that comes, certainly. There's pain in childbirth, but there's the wonderful gift of children as well. There is the necessity to toil for our livelihood, but work can become a huge blessing and something that we're involved in. In any case, it gives us the ability to survive. So you get in the account the failure of the human being, but at the same time, the fact that God stays with us. God is merciful and provides for us. Even in the next major episode, Cain has the mark of Cain to protect him after his murder of his brother. So I think that chapter 3 is a wonderful and most powerful kind of message in the Bible because it's a description of me. It's a description of all humankind. It's not isolated or confined to the experience of the first couple, as it were, but it represents the kind of struggles we all have as we sin. All right. So this is the word in Genesis 6 about God seeing the wickedness, and so he is going to attend to that, and that's after this sin and the first murder of Abel by Cain. All right, let's move on. So that's our first two experiences in 1 through 11. The flood and the aftermath are the following ones. The flood. We have, again, from the Babylonians, a comparison for our account. It's called the Gilgamesh Epic. Gilgamesh is a guy who is very keen to avoid death. And he says, has nobody ever done that? And he hears the story of Utnapishtim, who is the Babylonian Noah. And he finds Utnapishtim and he says, what did you do? Why did the gods make you immortal? And he goes through this account, which is very much like our account we have in Genesis. But Utnapishtim says to him, but you know, that was a very exceptional event. The gods are not going to do all of that just to save you. So what you need to do is live out your human life. It's a gift of God. It's to be enjoyed. It's to be grateful for. But what really had caught the eyes of the the scholars, as they read this, was how closely parallel the stories between Utnapishtim and Noah were. So an ark is built, the animals are brought on board, there are birds which are sent out, there's a covenant that is made. When you compare these, they look very, very close, but there are also differences that suggest, again, God's love for, God's care for this group of people. He's going to take care of them. Leonard Woolley at dug there and found this massive layer of mud and said, aha, this is the flood, evidence of the flood. But then you go down the road a few miles and dig at that same level and it's not, there's no evidence of it. So, you know, people began then to say, well, that was a local flood that perhaps prompted this account. Well, the aftermath of all of this is that sin continues. The sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth are recognized as the future of the world. And there's a curse that is placed on Canaan. Now, Canaan is the name of Palestine or modern day Israel, and the inhabitants there were the Canaanites. So these were the mortal enemies of the Hebrew people. So it's not surprising that you would have a curse placed on him. Let me pause to say at this point, you see this little image of stone, yeah, at the lower right-hand corner. This is in a cuneiform printing. Cuneiform simply means wedge-shaped. And the wedge-shaped writing was invented in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley area, very early on. And it was a way of writing and communicating that persisted in that part of the world for a very long time. In the 19th century, there was an English scholar who actually was a soldier, but he was a great linguist. He let himself down the face of the Behistun rock in Persia, and he could read Old Persian, so he wrote that out, and he wrote another several hundred lines of material in the cuneiform. And then he took it back to camp and worked on that and was able to decipher it. So now we have all of these texts in cuneiform that scholars who read this, study it, learn the language, can read today. So this is why this is important for us to know about the cuneiform or wedge-shaped writing. All right, let's move on. Okay, Babel, chapter 11. The Babel story was probably inspired by Ziggurats, which were temples that were built for the gods in Babylonia. We'll see a picture of one shortly. The idea of the genealogies also that you hear or see in the scripture are to trace especially the descendants of Shem or the Semites or the Hebrew people, and you go down to Terah and Abram or Abraham is of course the end of that genealogical list that they want to point out. All right, let's move on. Abraham and the patriarchs. Okay, we'll move on still. All right, now we move to Abraham and cultural background. Now we're at chapters, we begin with chapter 12, and the rest of Genesis 12 through 50 deals with the what we call the patriarchs, or the old guys, the fathers, the grandfathers of this culture, this group of people. So Abraham comes from an advanced civilization, Mesopotamia. That word simply means the land between the rivers. And this is why you could build a civilization there. You had constant flow of water in abundance. And so you built the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Persians, successively, one group after another taking charge here, but repeatedly borrowing and understanding how to use the cuneiform writing. So the Mari tablets that come from this era include biblical names, including Abraham, Benjamin, and Jacob. They also include, most interestingly, the covenant idea, which is really foundational for the Old Testament. So Mari is a city, a location in Mesopotamia. Likewise, Nutsi, and the Nutsi tablets refer to the adopted heir. So Abraham doesn't have a child, so what he can do is adopt a man to be his son and to take his inheritance. Sale of the birthright, you remember Jacob and Esau. The stealing of the family gods, you remember Rachel trying to hide the family gods because that was evidence that what they had was in their possession, or Abraham taking a concubine. So all of those practices are indicated in these tablets in the cuneiform that have been left to us on the Nutsi tablets. And finally, and much more famously, the Code of Hammurabi, with laws which parallel laws and rules that you find in the Old Testament. The origin of the Hebrews, word derivation, sometimes you'll see Hebrew, Aber is listed early in Genesis. Israelite, and of course Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And then toward the end of this whole story, later on, when Judah is what is left, then the shortened form of that is Jude. The Hebrew homeland, the biblical evidence is they've come from and Haran, and then come into the Holy Land. Now let's continue with that just a little bit. The archaeological and literary evidence suggests that these folks came from northwest Mesopotamia. So near Haran, which is in the Bible, and where Abraham goes, are the places called Sirud, Peleg, Terah, and Nahor. And all of those appear both as place names in northwest Mesopotamia and as places in, or people in the Old Testament. The creation and flood accounts have similarities as we've seen. We've just identified similar customs and laws, similar proper names of people. And the Hebrew is the Northwest Semitic language. So the conclusion of modern scholars is that Northwest Mesopotamia is the origin of the Hebrews and coming in this period 2000 to 1700 BC. Others have revised that to a more recent era, but this notion of coming from there still holds. Now, Abraham, is said, came from where there was moon worship the god of the moon. And this is what the Ziggurats looked like. That's a rebuilding of it. Actually, the original is still there. It's damaged over all these centuries, of course, but it is the building of a kind of a step pyramid. The idea that the god resides there or resides and comes and goes to this place, but it's a place of worship for them. So that became, and many people believe, a kind of an inspiration to the Tower of Babel, because the idea of Babel was, well, let's build this tower till we can reach all the way up to God. And that again is another example of human pride. And it led to God intervening and explains to people why there's so many different languages which separate us. Now that is called in biblical studies an etiology. If you give an account of something, a story to explain the origins of something, that's an etiology. So why does why does the snake go running around on the ground? Why is there pain in childbirth? The explanations for all of these things are called etiologies. Okay, so here we have an inset map with down at the bottom of the Tigris-Euphrates or Mesopotamian region, and then Haran up to the north. So Abraham is called to go there, and he just goes in faith. And he is elected by God to do this. So you're going to get the notion throughout the Old Testament of a chosen people and going back to Abraham. All right. So now you can see the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. This is modern day Iraq. You can see at Babylon, there's to the south, then Babylon, and then Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrians. And he goes all the way over here to Haran, Haran. And let's go back to the map just a moment. You can see, follow the red line. You see the line that Abraham took all the way down the coast and into Egypt, got in trouble there because he lied about his wife, saying it was his sister. And so he had to retreat. And then he goes back up into Israel. I don't know if you can see Hebron there, but that's the city of Abraham. Now note this kind of a crescent. And Henry Breasted, a famous Egyptian scholar, coined the term the Fertile Crescent. So you can see where all the cities are, and the people have to have water and have to have access to water in order to farm and what have you, whereas the Arabian desert was not open to that. So this explains then the journey of Abraham and then his retreat, the retraction up to near the Dead Sea. Okay. Now, the covenant.
Oh, just a minute.
Sorry, we have an interruption here. Okay, so the covenant with Abraham is very important. The word means to bond or to cut. This comes from the idea of cutting an animal in two, placing it at two sides, and then walking through it with the idea that you're walking with God through this. And this is the agreement that is reached, and this is what binds the two together. Circumcision is a sign of the covenant. The name change is a sign of the covenant, so it goes from Abram to Abraham. But the important thing here is the promises of God to the covenant. You will have heir and posterity, and you will have land, and you will be blessings to others. That's also indicated, but it emphasizes especially the first in Abraham's life, and then the taking of the land. You get that with Joshua and Judges. So that's down the road a ways. We'll talk about that next time. But this is a really, really important covenant, the covenant with Abraham. And to get those three things in mind, I think helps us understand the mindset and understand the goal, the wishes, the hope of these people. All right. So God initiates this covenant, and religion, I think, can be understood then as a relationship. You can liken a covenant to an agreement today. A covenant relationship is like a marriage. There are commitments and there are obligations on both sides for it to work, and that's what you're going to have, what you're going to see, especially with the prophets later on, when they're saying you're not keeping your covenant, you're not doing your fair share in this covenant relationship. So religion as relationship is an important notion in covenant. Now Hagar and Ishmael, chapter 16, because Abraham is and Sarah are not having a child, he takes the concubine and has Ishmael as a child. And then the next chapter, Abraham and Isaac, there's the tension because of the age of Sarah and of Abraham, but eventually there is a birth. But then there's, so that's a challenge that was overcome miraculously by God. And then there is the test to Abraham. Well, what if this boy is killed? What if you don't have this one to succeed you? Then how can the promise be kept? So again, there's the intervention of God at that point in time. So those accounts explain to us that it's God who starts this covenant and who makes sure that it's kept, that he makes it work out. Significant.
Bill, are the is the Islamite, are those the sons of Ishmael? Is that where or is that
Yeah,
just?
yeah. Today, it's ironic today that, in Israel, the Jewish people consider themselves to be the sons of Abraham and Isaac, and the Muslims, which surround Israel, look back to Ishmael as their ancestor. So yeah, that's quite right. So Abraham plays an important role for both of those religions and for Christianity as well. Yeah, good point. Okay, so Abraham is the beginning of the patriarchs and an ultimate ancestor of the faith of these folks. Let's move on. Jacob and Esau, these are the sons of Isaac. So Isaac's just kind of a connector, but you have a cycle of Abraham accounts, and then Jacob accounts, and then later Joseph. So Jacob and Esau, the birth and their struggle there. These are eponyms, which simply means a name that is placed on a group of people or on a region. But they're the eponyms for Israel and for Edom. The birthright and blessing, you know those stories where there's a lot of taking of sides by parents and deceit and so on that goes on, ending up with the younger over the older. Jacob renews the covenant of Abraham at Bethel. And there he has this image, this vision, this dream of angels ascending and descending on the ladder. But he has to move on. He has to go back to Laban. He goes back to Haran. These families want to go back to the homeland to find an appropriate wife. And so that, again, is further evidence of Northwest Mesopotamia. After many years making his living there with Laban, his father-in-law and so forth, he returns to Israel and encounters God at Peniel. There the name is changed to Israel. So Jacob's name is changed to Israel after this encounter. And then you get the sons of Israel that are named, that are laid out, and those become the names for, or eponyms for, the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, let's move on. So the religion of the patriarchs. Now, what would their religion be like if it stopped before Moses? Well, you have the essential features: their belief in God and their belief in a covenant relationship. But the idea of God is not yet fully understood or developed by them. We seem to have the idea that there's a particular God for a clan or for a small group of people, kind of a personal deity, because we have these phrases: the shield of Abraham, that's God, or the kinsman of Isaac, or the champion of Jacob. So all of those kinds of things suggest we still have a ways to go, and Moses will help us with that. So let's move on. We also have names of God here in Genesis: El Shaddai, Almighty God; El Elyon, God Most High; El Olam, God Eternal; El Roi, God Who Sees; El Bethel, the God of the house of God. So there are all these El combinations. El was a very, very common name for God in patriarchal literature. And so the idea then here is that he is seen in all of these different lights. Now, scholars emphasize and introduce here the notion of henotheism. Everybody knows polytheism, many gods; monotheism, one God. But here they recognize the existence of different gods for other people. In other words, the Edomites have their God. The Ammonites have their God. The Babylonians have their God. But we have only our God. So they recognize that other people believe that they have. But this is also designated monolatry. You should worship only one God. Now, some ancient social practices that have been abandoned, but are very prominent in Genesis and Exodus, are polygamy and slavery. So having many wives, or holding people in bondage. Those were the practices. And it's, this plays out in African Christianity today. If the missionaries go in and say, you have to give up 3 of your 4 wives, then where does that put that society, that group of people? And so what many of the Africans have done is simply form their own churches and keep some of these other practices, not slavery, but the polygamy. All right, let's move on. Joseph. So now we're at the last of these 4 characters, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We have here a kind of a fully developed story, a narrative about Joseph and his brothers. And it's told to explain to us how the Hebrew people got into Egypt and their settlement in their region of Goshen. So how Israel came to Egypt, all right? Now, Joseph and Egyptian politics. So Exodus is the most important event in the Old Testament. Why is that? Because that shows the Hebrew people that God cares for them and that he actually saved them when they were in an impossible situation. We have Egyptian history and start way, way back with the dynasty and the conquest of Narmer. Manetho put all these dynastic stories into order. Excuse me. And then so you have the old kingdom and then an intervention, a new middle kingdom, an intervention, and a new kingdom. In this course, there's an invasion by a group of people called the Hyksos, and they conquered and controlled and ran Egypt for this period of time indicated. They had mastered bronze. They built a lot better forts. They could use horses and chariots, and they simply overwhelmed their enemies. So the Israelites may have come into Egypt around 1700. If we follow this chronology of Abraham indicated earlier, there's a restoration of Egyptian rule under Amosi about 1570. And meanwhile, you have Akhenaten. We should know about him. There's his picture just to the right, and his wife, Nefertiti. This guy had the notion that we should have and worship only one God, and this is the sun god. Thank you. So of course, the question then was, did Moses get his ideas from the Egyptians or not? And well, what happened to this guy was he was discredited, and they rubbed out as many of these as they possibly could, remain polytheistic. So it's the Hebrew people who affirm monotheism and carry it through to the present day. All right. Israel and Egyptian politics continued. The Tel El Amarna Letters. These are letters written from Canaan down to Egypt in the 1300s BC. And this is an example, but they complain about taxes, and no surprise there. They complain about having to support the Egyptian occupying forces there. No surprise there either. But they do admit there's a lot of warfare that goes on between city-states, and they're grateful to have somebody there to keep order. Otherwise, we have political disunity in this region. So that's what the reason you have the Tel El Amarna Letters introduced is it shows something of the nature of Canaan a century before the Israelites appeared. All right. Israel and Egyptian politics. Well, of course, Tutankhamun is one of the more famous characters in Egyptian history. This is a picture of Howard Carter, who discovered this place, and working through all of the finds of Tutankhamun, which is just absolutely spectacular. He was really a minor pharaoh, but they pulled together for his early burial a huge treasure trove of materials, which is in the Cairo Museum now, and which goes on tour from time to time. There's the entrance to the burial site. You can pay a little fee and go downstairs and take a picture there of this very famous spot. So this is 1350 BCE. That's 150 years before Moses. So this suggests a really advanced culture that you have here. All right, let's go on. So the Hebrew people, we're told, were placed under oppression. And we think that the Pharaoh there is Seti or Sethos, the Greek ending. They were forced to do rigorous work, and many of the infant boys were killed to keep population down. The date of the Exodus has been narrowed to the time of Ramses II. And he ruled a very long time, 1290 to 1224. And the reason we come up with that is that Ramses had these people who were enslaved to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses. We also know that these little countries to the east of Palestine, Edom and Moab, were not settled before 1300. Archaeologists have shown that. So, but when the Hebrews came out of the Sinai Peninsula, they met resistance at both of these. So this helps us place a beginning and an ending point for the presence of the Hebrew people. The Stela of Merneptah, a stela is simply an upright stone that's inscribed. And so you see the picture of it here just to the right. And down at the bottom, there's a sort of a line has been drawn under a passage that says that I, Merneptah, defeated the Hebrew people in Israel. Well, that's the first evidence that we have outside the Bible, and one that we can date. This is 1207 BC. So Palestinian cities are destroyed. We'll get to some of this again next time as we enter into Canaan. And then there's this 40-year tradition of staying in the wilderness. So this would give us a date of Exodus at about 1280 BC. There's a picture of Ramses in the coffin, and then he is recognized at Abu Simbel as well. Okay, let's go ahead. Moses and the Exodus. So the book of Exodus 1 through 18 is the Exodus event. It simply means deliverance or exiting or leaving Egypt. And then the next half of the book has to deal with the covenant of Sinai and the idea of this relationship or covenant that is what we call the Mosaic or covenant. Okay, so Moses' significance. Moses generally recognized as the most important figure in the Old Testament. Why? Well, he is the physical leader of this Exodus. He identifies the name of God, Yahweh, which then begins to be used universally. And he is the lawgiver to this group of people. So the Torah, the first 5 books, the book of the law, now come to focus in the God who saved them, in the name of this God, and then the guidelines or the rules that he gives for them. All right. So this name, Moses, means beget, and it's an Egyptian term. So here he is, he's grown up, he's been born in Egypt and grows up there and so forth. His family were given some information about Miriam, who is his sister, and Aaron, his brother, and the fact that he will also be important as a lawgiver. Aaron will become the spokesman, and Aaron is the the first high priest. Miriam sings the praises to Yahweh in the wilderness for the event of the Exodus. So Moses comes from two cultures, both the Egyptian and the captive Hebrew. Moses, you remember a number of the stories about Moses being saved, the bulrushes, getting angry at somebody who is mistreating one of his fellows, and then having to flee, having to run away. And so he goes to Midian. If you look at the map to the lower right-hand corner, the land of Midian, you go past the Suez Canal, past the Gulf of Aqaba, and in then to the land of Midian. And that's where he goes for the middle third of his life. And that's where he gets his wife, has a Zipporah, has a son, Gershom, and in a sense is, is a herdsman and is prepared to lead people in the Sinai when they leave Egypt. His father-in-law is Jethro or Ruel. Again, a doublet. You have two different names for the same person, which suggests, again, multiple sources for the Torah writing. All right, let's move on. The burning bush episode, this is called a theophany. When you have a visible appearance of the presence of God. Theos is God. And so the idea is that God makes himself known, God appears. And so this is the call. This will determine his life work. And he protests, who are you? And so God will give him his answer. And what authority, if I go back and try to bring these people out of Goshen, by what authority will I do that? And besides that, I'm a poor speaker. I can't do all these things you're asking me to do. So he protests his call to be a minister, as it were. All right. Now, the name that is given to him by God or by Yahweh is Yahweh, Yahweh. This is called, these four letters are called collectively the Tetragrammaton, which simply means four letters, YHWH. Now, why that? Well, this is what you have in the Hebrew. They didn't have the vowels added. And the people thought the name was so sacred that they wouldn't pronounce it. Because if you take the name of God in vain, then that is a violation of the commandment. So, how they were actually, how it was produced, how it was pronounced was lost for a long period of time. I think they recreated it pretty accurately by reading the later Greek Old Testament, which was called the Septuagint. But in any case, let's go to the meanings. You have to be or YHWH simply means he is. The tense is not given. It can be he is or he will be or I will be. So the meaning of I am that I am can be you don't know who I am, it's a mystery, or it can also be very much be, and more likely it seems to be I am the one who is for you. I am beside you. I support you. I'm beside you. So how in the world do we get this name Jehovah in the King James Version then? Well, we keep the consonants of YHWH, and then looking around for proper vowels, we use the vowels for another Hebrew name for God, Adonai, and you put that together and you get YAHOWAH or AIH, and change in the pronunciation, the Y to the J. And so you get this kind of hybrid word or combined word, Jehovah. Okay, let's move on. So Moses, we have the famous plagues and wonders. The story cycle is there's a request for release. The response is no. A plague is sent. The Pharaoh relents. The plague is removed. And then the Pharaoh's mind is changed, or in the King James Version, he hardened his heart. He said no. And so another plague is sent. So this is the cycle. And then you just plug in the 10 plagues. Next page. Yeah, so Dan has found us examples of all the plagues there that that these folks endured during that period of time. All right, and of course it's the last plague that is decisive. Let's move on. Deliverance, Exodus 12 through 15, and to celebrate that deliverance is the first, the oldest, the most important of the Jewish events, which is Passover. Chapter 12, this is celebrated at that point in time. Miriam sings. Jethro, the father-in-law, is the guy who presides over this service. So the question is, did Moses have conversation with him as well about the nature of God and the name for God and so forth? Now, these folks are located in Goshen, which is, if you go to the Nile Delta and off to the far right, is where they were placed. So this was good pasturage, but it's also a good buffer area or zone for people that might be invading from the Levant or from Israel, from Mesopotamia. So they cross then at, there's a mistranslation here of Red Sea. It should be Yam Suf is Reed Sea in chapter 14. So if you can see on the map, if you go all the way down from Goshen, or go from the Delta, and you see down to the other side, up to the Mediterranean. Yeah, this is, there we go. Okay. Well, it's okay. You can see the Sinai is the triangle that comes down here to a point, and Goshen is to the north west of that. So that's the Suez Canal that finishes off the Gulf of Suez. That's it. That's right, Gulf. And then there's a canal built through there. That was a marshy area, and that's where this Reed Sea was located. If you go to the Red Sea, come on down, Dan. That's right. Further down, right? That's the Red Sea. And it's about 100 miles across there. And then you'd be way off from Sinai. So anyway, that's just a very famous kind of mistranslation. Songs of Victory, that's Miriam. All right, let's move on. In the wilderness. So this is the Sinai Peninsula or desert, and it's also called the wilderness in and the wilderness wanderings, the next 40 years of these people in the Sinai. Now, there were 4 established routes in this wilderness. The way of the Philistines takes you from Goshen in the upper left-hand corner, takes you from there right up the coast into Canaan. That's the way of the Philistines. They couldn't go that way because there were Egyptian troops along there. You could go straight east to Kadesh. Kadesh is just down just a little bit there, Dan. Kadesh is really important because that's where they're going to camp for most of the 40 years. Then Goshen, you could go to Ezion Geber, which is at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba, just down to the right there a little bit. And Ezion Geber, there's mining that goes on there. And so there's a pathway over there as well. And then Goshen south to Sinai. So this is the traditional route that you go down the left side of the Sinai Peninsula and end up where the pointer is, down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula. And that's where people today locate Jebel Musa. They had lots of difficulties in the wilderness. They ran out of water, they didn't have food. God provided the water and the manna and the quail. They were remembering all the good tasting things they had back in Egypt. And they were grumbling, they were unhappy and so forth. So they were dispirited. There were a number of difficulties the leaders had to cope with. All right. So the location for the arguments for the old traditional place at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula says it's 11 days to Kadesh, and that's about right. There are oases all along the way down to the Sinai. And this is a Christian tradition. Christians began to make pilgrimage to this area in the third, fourth, fifth centuries. And there's a monastery that St. Catherine's, which was built in 527, very famous in this lower part of the Sinai Peninsula. But still, that's much later than the time of the wilderness wandering. So an alternative possibility is that in following the cloud by day and the fire by night, that they were looking at the top of a volcano. And there are no volcanoes in the southern part of this peninsula, but there are up in the north around Kadesh or over toward Midian. So that's debated. I'd say what I read, probably 90% of scholars stay with the old traditional site in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Okay. Literary analysis of the Pentateuch. Now, if you just read the Pentateuch and say, when did we arrive at Sinai? Well, this is about Exodus 19. And then when did they leave? They leave not until Numbers 10. So you have half of Exodus, Leviticus, and the first part of Numbers in terms of a literary analysis before they pick up and start moving to Kadesh Barnea. Okay, let's move on. In other words, Sinai is really predominant. Now, the covenant, making of the covenant in 19:1, this is the giving of the covenant or the law, giving of the law. There's a call to obey. The famous Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and thou shalt have no other gods beside me. So that is actually a later version of it in Deuteronomy 6:4, but it is the call, it is the hear, the call to listen to the commandments. Okay, 10 commandments or Decalogue. Exodus 20, and it's also found in Exodus 34 and in Deuteronomy 5, but the list that we always turn to is this one. All right, Dan, let's move on. There you have, thou shalt have no other gods before me, make no graven image, shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So those four are sort of the vertical, my relationship to God. Then it starts with my relationship with you, with other people, honor father and mother. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, that is lie, and thou shalt not covet. So in different traditions, this is the 10 commandments. Some will combine make no image with no other gods, but if they do that, then they will divide thou shalt not covet people and things. But in any case, I think it's right probably that the list is 10 in order to be as an aid to memory. Thou shalt not bear false witness. That's the basis for a legal system. Thou shalt not kill, commit adultery, or steal. That's found universally in many, many cultures. That's a solid basis for society. And so what's unique here, I think, is both the message about God and combining that with our responsibility to each other. Now, the covenant code in Exodus 21 through 23 of Hammurabi, go ahead, is, it gives us examples. It gives us, you take these, and then in the next 3 chapters, it will give you examples of how to apply these. So if you're a bull runs over somebody and kills them, then you're not guilty. But if it's been the habit of doing that, or if you don't do something about it, then it happens again, then you are guilty. And so it's what we call case law. If then, this is why you have so many books in the lawyer's office. You have all these cases, but these are the controlling principles that you start with, called apodictic kinds of rules. Thou shalt, or do this. But then you have to explain. You have to go with all of those. What about, we killed the Canaanites. Well, then we need to narrow that. Thou shalt not murder, etc. So, okay, go ahead. Significance of Moses, Yahwism, leader of the Exodus, giving of the law. Okay, go ahead. So, cultus is the technical term for worship, and the word means care. So, what we do for the care of God or the care of the deity, what would please God? What do we do from 11 to 12 in a service of worship, in a mass or in a Protestant service or whatever? Major themes in Israel's worship included historical recollection and commemoration, forgiveness and gratitude. And I think all those really, really fit well with what we can do and what we can implement in our own worship services. Leviticus is a handbook of religious practice. And you'll find a lot of the cultus described in the latter part of Exodus and throughout Numbers as well. All right. Sacrifice, the Bible does not tell us what that means, unfortunately. So we have to infer. And what we've inferred is it means by sharing the life of the animal, but we take on some of the vitality when that's released, and we connect with God. We can use sacrifice as a gratitude, means of gratitude, a means of seeking forgiveness, and a means of being with God and with one another. All right. The end of sacrifice in Judaism came in the first century because the temple was destroyed. And so they moved to just reading scripture and praying. Ritual purity, that's important for the worshiper, the animal, the priest. And also it's important to recognize that some people didn't have animals. It was just as fine to make grain offerings or non-animal offerings. All right, move on. So the symbols of God's presence among us is in the wilderness is this portable throne, this ark. It's about 45 inches long and 2.5 feet high and wide. You see the cherubim on top and the poles for carrying it. But the idea is that God rests on the top of this ark. All right, that's his throne. Also, he gets a tabernacle or temple. It's a elaborate tent, and there you see the Holy of Holies, where the ark is placed, and an altar for incense, and one so it'll smell good. A table of bread for feeding, and a table for lamps or for light as well. So that's a tribute to God. All right. The wilderness, we'll catch that actually at the beginning of our next session. Let's move on. Worship guidelines, sacrifice, purity, festivals, carry on. That's Leviticus. Numbers, the camp is at Kadesh Barnea. The reconnaissance goes into Canaan. Travel in Transjordan, and a new leader, Joshua, will emerge. All right. So here's where we will start next time as we make our entry just above the Dead Sea from the east of the Jordan River and into Canaan. One more, I think. So Deuteronomy, this is the 5th book in the Torah. Remember God, and then the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the God, our God is one God. Keep this covenant. Curses and blessings that are laid out clearly, and there's the importance of the purity of worship in Jerusalem and keeping the faith there, because people had started using Canaanite shrines all across the land. All right. And this is next week. We'll start with the assault under Joshua on the Holy Land.
Next month. Next month.
Yeah, sorry, next month. That's right. Infiltration by the judges and occupation of the hill country. All right. So, any questions? That's a lot to cover.
Bill, I've heard it said sometimes that the first 5 books of the Bible were either written by or written for Moses. Is that just hearsay or what?
That was a tradition of the Jewish community and the Christian community up until, it began to be questioned a little bit in the 18th century. There's a fellow by the name of Gene Astruc who read the Hebrew Bible carefully and saw these two different names for God and different versions and so forth. So he wondered if there were two sources, not just Moses as the source. And then Graff and Wellhausen in the 1870s identified 4 strands or 4 sources that came later than the time of Moses. So modern scholarship questions that idea. But you can also call it the book of Moses in the sense that the book of Exodus is key, and that he's the leader of the Exodus and gave the law and that sort of thing.
Any other questions?
I have a question, Donna King. I'm always amazed when I see the journeys that these people take. For example, looking at Abraham,
Right,
that's a lot of miles to cover on foot.
that's
I
right.
mean, you know, this is the,
It's quite amazing. But they had their flocks with them for food, and they had their tents with them, and they could move along. They were accustomed, nomads were accustomed to moving with their crops from one pasture to another, usually a couple of places in a year's time. So he didn't do this overnight. No, you're quite right. This would have taken a long time. And early on, they had ass nomads or donkeys, not camels, so they couldn't go across the desert. They had to stay near watering holes and had to care for those animals as well. But yeah, that's quite a journey for them to have made. That's
And
a
so-
very good point. Good historical imagination. How in the world did they do that?
and so these people were basically nomads. That was their way of living, even if they didn't have a destination.
Yes,
They just wandered.
I think that that's generally the understanding of the Israelites as they come into the land. But when they come into Canaan and there are cities there and there are farms, and they realize farming is far superior because you can be stabilized, you can be in one place and grow a crop and so forth. And so there were sort of combinations, I think, that went on there. But Abraham's experience, we don't know much about him personally, but if he came from Ur, from a big city, then, you know, he had access to the animals, but also to some sense of the culture and city life, which always means making things and selling things, you know. What else?
Thank you.
Other
Yes,
questions?
good question. Thank you.
Well, Bill, thank you so much. I think
All right.
we had a really good overview here and understanding. I've got to go back in the booklet now and read a little bit more, and maybe I'll go back and watch this recording because it will be shown on the website next week.
All right, very good.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
All
Thank
right.
you.
See you next month.
All right.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye. Dan,
Yes.
where did you say that Bill Pitts, his name sounds very familiar to me.
Bill, we lived in Waco up until 5 years ago, and Bill taught at Baylor University.
Where was he before that? Do you know?
It was over in Tennessee, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Bill, are you still on there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I taught at